In 2012, when Theresa May was Home Secretary, she said, "The aim is to create, here in Britain, a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants." The following year, her department paid for vans to tour the streets of London with the message, "In the UK illegally? Go home or face arrest." This was how she explained her outlook on Radio 4's Today in 2013.
I think for most people out there, they'll say, well, it can't be fair for people who have no right to be here in the UK to be able to continue to exist as everybody else with bank accounts, with driving licences, with access to rented accommodation. We're going to be changing this because we don't think that's fair.
Trying to make things fairer involved getting employers, landlords, the NHS and others to get proof from people that they were legally in the UK. For some, including the children of the Windrush immigrants, that was a problem. They came to the UK on their parents' passports and never became naturalised. For several months, Amelia Gentleman at The Guardian has been detailing their stories, including that of Paulette Wilson, who she met in November.
This is a grandmother who lives in Wolverhampton, who's 61, who moved to the UK when she was 10 in 1968 from Jamaica, and she's never left the country. Because she'd never applied for a passport here, never formally naturalised, she found herself cast a couple of years ago as an illegal immigrant. She was taken in November to Yarl's Wood, which is an immigration removal centre, where she was held for a week before being taken to Heathrow ahead of a deportation to Jamaica. And it was only a last-minute intervention from her MP that stopped her from being taken out of the country where she'd lived for over half a century. It's important to say that Paulette is somebody who's worked in the UK all her life. She even worked in the House of Commons for a while, serving food to MPs. And this, for her, was the most devastating experience.
This story has burst into the headlines in the last couple of days. You, of course, have been working on it for a long time, and it's come to public prominence in part because of your work. We know what the government response is today. When you first started knocking on the Home Office door and phoning them, how did they respond to your requests about the very people everyone are now talking about?
So I've probably taken up cases of about a dozen people in this kind of situation over the past 5 months with the Home Office. On each occasion, they were quite anxious to say, give us the details of these people and we'll sort out their cases. But at the same time, there was an implicit rebuke in their response, because they seem to be saying all the time, well, these people haven't filled in the right form, they haven't applied for the right naturalisation status, they haven't applied for passports. There seemed to be a real indifference and a lack of understanding that applying for passports is quite an expensive process, that getting legal advice is very, very expensive, and there is no legal aid to try and sort out these kind of situations. The burden of proof required by the Home Office from these people is incredibly high, and often people have been required to send in documents charting their time in the UK with 4 bits of paper documents for every year that they've been here, so going back decades.
Amelia Gentleman of The Guardian, we'll hear more from her in a moment. But how has the government viewed these cases before this week? Last month in the House of Commons, Jeremy Corbyn raised the case of one man.
I would indeed be writing to the Prime Minister about the case I'm concerned about. It's a man who's lived in this country for 44 years, worked and paid his taxes, obviously is an older gentleman, and is now being denied cancer treatment. And I suspect he's not alone in this, and I urge her to discuss this with the Home Office and others.
This was Theresa May's response.
So, as I say, I look forward to receiving the details of the case that he has just set out. What we have done in relation to cancer treatment is ensure there are more diagnostic tests taking place.
And she went on to talk about cancer treatment in detail. She replied later in writing to Jeremy Corbyn's question. She said she had sympathy with Mr Thompson and the worries he will be facing given his condition, but said he needed to evidence his settled status in the UK. As recently as yesterday, Downing Street refused to allow a meeting between Theresa May and Commonwealth leaders over the treatment of Windrush citizens. Then suddenly a change of tune. Downing Street said the meeting could take place, and the Home Secretary Amber Rudd issued an apology, which we reported last night. Today, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Andrew Holness, spoke at the Commonwealth Leaders Summit about the treatment of the Windrush generation.
These persons are not able to claim their place as citizens. Prime Minister, we welcome your response and we look forward to a speedy implementation of your proposed solution. It is only fair. It will lead to security, certainly for those who have been affected, and it is the kind of inclusive prosperity for which we stand as Commonwealth peoples.
And this was what Theresa May had to say.
I want to dispel any impression that my government is in some sense clamping down on Commonwealth citizens, particularly those in the Caribbean who built a life here. I take this issue very seriously. The Home Secretary apologised to the House of Commons yesterday for any anxiety caused, and I want to apologise to you today because we are genuinely sorry for any anxiety that has been caused.
Theresa May apologising for any anxiety that's been caused. Colin Yeo has been an immigration lawyer for 18 years.
I can still remember one of my first lessons, so to speak, which was that in the UK, we check people's papers for immigration purposes when they enter the UK at the border, and it's done by trained immigration officials. But that's something that's really changed over the last few years. And now it's much more commonplace to check papers within the country, and it's not just trained officials who are doing it. It's private citizens. We have to check each other's papers. Landlords have to check tenants. Banks have to check papers. Healthcare officials have to check papers. Employers have to check papers.
When was that change introduced?
It's been a gradual one. Employers have had to check papers in theory from 1996 onwards, but that's something that only really started to get sort of enforced from about 2006 onwards. And then in 2012, Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, announced what she herself described as the hostile environment, and started to expand that to other areas of life as well. So that's when they introduced what they call the right to rent checks, where landlords have to check the papers of tenants, and that came into force in about 2015.
What's been the effect on people you try to help?
Immigration control has been something that used to happen at the border. It's something that's much more all-pervasive. It happens sort of all sorts of different bits of everyday life, basically. And unfortunately, we're seeing that it has quite a discriminatory effect. So you're much more likely to be asked for your papers if you are black or ethnic minority. If you're white, then people will often assume that you're not an immigrant and that you don't require immigration papers, so you won't even get asked for them. Whereas if you're not, then you are asked for them. And that can be quite a pernicious impact. It can be very unpleasant to be asked for papers because of your skin colour.
What do you say to the view that whatever problems there may be with Windrush and the documentation and all of that, that the immigration policy as legislated for by Parliament was done by Parliament and was in response to widespread, not unanimous, but widespread public concern about immigration and people being illegally employed when they had no right to be here, people using the NHS, draining the NHS's resources and all of that. Haven't the changes been brought in to try to assuage those concerns?
That's certainly what people say has happened. Whether it really does assuage those concerns to have landlords checking tenants' immigration papers and so on is more questionable. And there's been very little in way of research of whether there really is, for example, what they sometimes call healthcare tourism. And in fact, so far the studies that I've seen have suggested that the introduction of those checks has been very bureaucratic. It's very expensive, actually, to run that kind of checking system. And the amount that they recover in fees from people who aren't entitled to healthcare from the NHS is actually outweighed by the costs of implementing the checks in the first place. So yes, it has been done in response to concerns, but whether it's actually assuaged those concerns or just enhanced them, in fact, and people didn't want some sort of additional system of discrimination to be introduced that would make it harder to access services if you're black or ethnic minority.
What do you think of the Windrush controversy?
Well, it's something that lawyers like me have been aware of for a few years, that long-term residents who've been here for decades sometimes just don't have their papers. And sometimes those people will be British citizens. So I think the last census showed that it's about 9 million people, I think it might be, who don't have passports because they don't want to go on holiday abroad. And those kinds of people, they basically need a passport now if they're going to rent a property or get a job. And you're in a situation where people are having to apply for passports not to go on holiday, but in order to access services here in the UK. And it's like a de facto system of identity cards, in effect.
That's immigration lawyer Colin Yeo. So what's going on inside the Home Office? Amelia Gentleman at The Guardian has a story online tonight which hears from someone who knows.
We've been contacted by a former Home Office official who worked in one of the departments responsible for processing these kind of cases. And he told us that in October 2010, the government decided to get rid of a huge archive of thousands of landing card slips that recorded the date of Windrush immigration's arrival into the UK. This decision was taken against the advice of caseworkers in this Home Office department. They told their bosses that it would be a really bad idea to destroy these records because it meant that there was no last backup point to go to in case of a disputed entry date. And the reason that the entry date is so significant is because if you arrived in the UK before 1973, then you have an automatic right to be here. So when people in this situation are trying to resolve their difficult immigration situation, having that piece of proof is incredibly important.
The Home Office has confirmed that it destroyed some landing cards belonging to Windrush immigrants, but says the slips did not provide reliable evidence of someone's residency in the UK. Danny Shaw is our Home Affairs correspondent. All of these warning cases, we had the lawyer there saying they've known about this for years. Why are we only worried about it now?
I think it's partly because the cases that have been highlighted in the past week have been very powerful, moving cases. I think that there are two other key factors. One is that we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the Rivers of Blood speech, and that's focused people's attention on race relations in Britain. And also we've got the Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit, and it has become an issue for them. And I think the coming together of all those issues has made it something that can't be ignored, as well as the fact that I think the Home Office has been far less sure-footed in the handling of this than they probably would have wished. And that has been capitalised on by opposition MPs, and particularly by David Lammy yesterday in the Commons, who gave a very powerful intervention. So this is an issue that didn't have any political traction in 2015, 2016, 2017, but it certainly does now.
Has there been a mood change, if not a policy change, at the Home Office?
Well, I think Amber Rudd is quite a different person from Theresa May. I think some of her instincts are perhaps more liberal, and Theresa May was certainly trying very hard to get net migration under control, to bring it down to the tens of thousands. When Amber Rudd has been asked about that, she uses the phrase sustainable levels rather than tens of thousands. These are subtle shifts, and I think that certainly is playing into it. And I think the Home Office is a bit more vulnerable now than it was under Theresa May, and particularly after Amber Rudd's violent crime strategy last week, which was undermined by the leak suggesting that police numbers was certainly a factor. And I think all this is playing into it.
And there may be people listening who are very interested as dispassionate observers in the Windrush controversy, but think, well, it's not going to affect me. But you think perhaps some people might be affected? Well,
the Home Office later this year is going to launch a new system for people from EU countries who want to apply for settled status here to prove that they are here legally and that they can remain here permanently. Because they are saying that there are some 3.5 million EU nationals who will need to prove that after Brexit. So the system launches later this year. Now, can you imagine 3.5 million people going through that registration process? However simply the Home Office says they will make the process, there are going to be many thousands of people who perhaps don't have the documents to prove they've been here for at least 5 years. There will be many thousands of children of EU citizens, whether born abroad or in Britain, who may not realise that they have to apply. And also, as the Migration Observatory pointed out last week in a report, there may also be victims of domestic abuse who will struggle to provide the documentation because it relies on documents perhaps supplied by their partner and so on. So this is going to be the upcoming battle, I think, for the Home Office in the months and years to come.
Danny Shaw, our Home Affairs correspondent. James Robbins is our diplomatic correspondent. How bad is the timing here for Theresa May?
I think it could hardly be more appalling. This is a week when the British government hoped to highlight its central role in the Commonwealth, and almost all the 53 heads of government of the Commonwealth are on their way or already in London. for their meeting, which opens formally on Thursday. The whole royal family has been deployed to make them as welcome as possible, because Britain, apart from anything else, is seeking to mark out a post-Brexit Britain, looking increasingly to the Commonwealth for new trade deals and fostering the idea that you can be global without necessarily being a member of the European Union. But instead of that, of course, we have the Prime Minister apologising, particularly to Caribbean members, and saying this was in no way an act of discrimination against Commonwealth citizens. But we also heard earlier on, the applause that greeted the Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness, when, although he accepted the apology, he made it clear that we look forward to speedy implementation. And Mr. Holness said, without any menace, I think, but that Jamaica and the Caribbean countries would be holding Britain to account. The Prime Minister of St Kitts and Nevis, Timothy Harris, said, "We see this basically as the start of the dialogue, as evidence is uncovered which requires correction." He seemed to be hinting that there would be continuing pressure for compensation for all those who'd been affected by this. Another said, as Caribbean leaders, we have to accept the apology in good faith, but added that Mrs May had not been able to say definitively that nobody had been deported as a result of all these issues. So, a pretty strong sense coming from Caribbean leaders that they do not regard the matter as being closed just because the Prime Minister has issued an apology. Just one other quick thing. The Prime Minister was expecting to make a completely different apology today to the Commonwealth. She did make it. It's one she'd prepared already. And that was about Britain's part in framing laws discriminating against the LGBT community, particularly in imperial days. And these are laws which have survived in a majority of Commonwealth countries, up to 37 of them, which outlaw same-sex activity. And Mrs May, on behalf of Britain, took responsibility for the legacy of empire and how it lives on in what she regards as grossly discriminatory laws. That was an apology she was expecting to make, not this second one about the Windrush generation.
And in the past few minutes, James, the Prime Minister of Antigua, Gaston Browne, has told the BBC he thinks there should be reprisals for those who dropped the ball in the government for the embarrassment over the Windrush row. He says the issue of compensation for those who've been deported or lost their jobs should be looked at by the government in due course. Can the Prime Minister rest whatever her agenda was back on course?
She will certainly try. The pressure is not just coming from the Caribbean countries for perhaps heads to roll. I think you can sense it in Britain. But the Prime Minister wants to try to wrestle the agenda back to what she regards as really vital issues where she thinks the Commonwealth can add value when the summit gets fully underway later in the week. She's got one difficult issue to deal with, and that is whether she can get consensus among the leaders that Prince Charles should succeed his mother, the Queen, after her death as head of the Commonwealth. It's not a fixed automatic right of succession. That's quite a sensitive issue. She hadn't been looking forward to that particularly. She wants to get positive outcomes on plastics in the oceans, on increasing aid for children's education, particularly girls' education. She's already offered extra money for anti-malarial measures throughout the Commonwealth. So this is absolutely not the beginning of the Commonwealth Summit that she'd hoped for.
James Robbins, thank you. It's 5.